I have kept this light burning for 11 years. 11 years of climbing the same 112 steps every evening before sunset, trimming the same wick, checking the same lenses, logging the same weather readings into the same leather-bound journal that the Coast Guard issues every lighthouse keeper on the Maine coast. 11 years of storms that bend the iron railing outside the lantern room until you think it's going to snap clean off. 11 years of fog so thick you can't see your own hand in front of your face. 11 years of watching ships pass in the night, their running lights moving slowly across the black water like fireflies that couldn't quite decide where they wanted to go. I know this stretch of coastline better than I know my own face. I know where the rocks are. I know where the currents run dangerous. I know where the sandbars shift after winter storms, and I know which fishermen are going to ignore my warning signals and try to cut through the channel anyway. I know all of these things because this is my job, and I am very good at my job. But there are things out there in the water that I cannot log in any journal. There are things that move through this stretch of coast that no navigation chart has ever accounted for. Things that the Coast Guard would never believe, things that my predecessor never warned me about, and things that I have spent the last 3 years trying to convince myself I didn't actually see. My name is Thomas Aldric. I am 54 years old. I have a daughter in Portland who calls me every Sunday and asks me when I'm going to retire and move closer to the city. I have a dog named Compass who sleeps at the bottom of my bed and growls at the water on certain nights for no reason I have ever been able to identify. And I have a story that I need to tell before something happens to me, because I am not entirely convinced that what lives in the water outside this lighthouse is finished with me yet. It started 3 years ago, in November, during what the Weather Service was calling the worst storm to hit the Maine coast in 40 years. The waves were running 25 feet. The wind was coming in at 60 miles an hour sustained, with gusts pushing past 80. The kind of storm that makes the lighthouse itself vibrate, where you can feel the whole structure flexing slightly against the force of the water. I had been awake for 31 hours straight, monitoring the conditions, sending weather updates to the Coast Guard every 2 hours, making sure the light stayed operational. Compass wouldn't leave my side. He kept pressing his body against my legs wherever I moved, which was unusual for him. He's an independent dog on most nights, happy to curl up in his corner and sleep through whatever the Atlantic throws at us. But that night, he was attached to me like a shadow. Around 2 in the morning, I climbed to the lantern room to check on the mechanism. The light was functioning correctly, rotating at its programmed interval, throwing its beam out across the water in the pattern that every vessel in this region would recognize as the Harwick Point light. I stood at the lantern room window and watched the storm for a while. The sea was extraordinary. Even through the rain-streaked glass, it was a spectacular and terrifying thing to witness. Walls of black water rising and collapsing in the beam of the light, spray exploding off the rocks at the base of the point with enough force to reach the gallery railing 40 feet above the waterline. I was about to go back downstairs when I saw the first light. It was out past the breakwater, maybe 3/4 of a mile offshore, right in the middle of where the worst of the storm was running. It was a single white light, steady, not blinking, not moving the way a vessel's running light would move. It was just sitting there in the water, completely stationary, while 25-foot waves rolled through the area all around it. My first thought was a buoy, but I know every buoy in this sector and none of them are positioned that far offshore. My second thought was a vessel in distress, anchored and holding position while they waited out the storm. I grabbed the radio and put out a general call on Channel 16, asking if any vessel in the vicinity of Harwick Point needed assistance. No response. I tried again. Nothing. I picked up the binoculars and tried to get a better look through the rain and the spray, but the conditions made it almost impossible to see any detail. The light was just there, white and steady and completely wrong for the location and the conditions. Then a second light appeared. This one was further out, maybe 1.5 miles from shore, and it was moving. Not moving the way a ship moves, forward and purposeful with a predictable heading. It was moving in a slow arc, sweeping back and forth across the water in a pattern that reminded me of nothing so much as something searching, like a hand moving through dark water, feeling for something on the bottom. The 2 lights stayed out there for 40 minutes. I logged them both, noted the time and position as best I could estimate, and kept trying to raise them on the radio. Nothing. Then the storm reached its peak, a series of 3 massive wave sets that hit the point in quick succession, And when the spray cleared and I could see the water again, both lights were gone. I told myself it was debris. Fishing equipment, buoys that had broken loose from their moorings, containers that had fallen off a cargo ship somewhere upwind. I told myself there were perfectly rational explanations for stationary lights in impossible locations. I almost believed it. Almost. 6 weeks later, in January, the lights came back. This time the weather was clear. No storm, no spray, just a cold, still night with the temperature dropping toward zero and the stars out in that particular brilliant January way they have when there's no humidity in the air. I saw them from the gallery during my midnight check. 3 lights this time, arranged in a loose triangle about half a mile offshore. They were below the surface. That was the first time I understood that whatever these lights were, they were not vessels. No vessel running light sits below the waterline. These lights were coming up through the water from somewhere beneath it, diffused slightly by the depth, but still distinct, still clearly 3 separate sources arranged in that loose triangular pattern. I stood on the gallery in 0-degree weather for 45 minutes watching them. Compass sat beside me the whole time, pressed against my leg, not growling, not barking, just watching the water with an intensity that I found more unsettling than any sound he could have made. The lights moved, slowly, in a way that suggested something enormous shifting its position. The triangle widened over the course of 20 minutes, each light drifting outward from the others, until they were spread across an area of water roughly 400 yards across. Then, one by one, they went out. I filed a report with the Coast Guard the next morning. The duty officer I spoke to was polite and professional and entirely dismissive. He said there were bioluminescent organisms in the water that could produce exactly the kind of light display I was describing. He said unusual current patterns sometimes made debris cluster in unexpected locations. He said he would note my report in the system. His tone of voice told me clearly that he would not. I started keeping a separate log. In addition to the official Coast Guard journal, I began a personal record of every unusual observation I made from this lighthouse. The date, the time, the weather conditions, what I saw, how long it lasted, what direction it moved. Over the next 8 months, I filled 117 pages of a standard composition notebook with these observations. The lights appeared 14 more times in those 8 months. They were never the same twice. Sometimes there were 2, sometimes 6 or 7. Sometimes they were near the surface and sometimes deep. Once, during a foggy night in April, one of them came close enough to the point that I could see it from the base of the lighthouse, below the waterline in the shallow rocky area where nothing larger than a harbor seal should have been able to fit. It was enormous. Even diffused by the water and the fog, the light source was clearly something of tremendous size. I stood at the top of the access stairs that lead down to the boat landing, gripping the railing, and I watched this light move slowly through water that was maybe 15 feet deep, and the light was bigger across than a school bus. It moved without sound. That was the thing that caught in my chest and wouldn't leave. Something that large moving through 15 feet of water should have been audible, should have displaced enough water to cause waves on the surrounding rocks. But the surface of the water was completely undisturbed. Whatever was producing that light was doing so without making any physical impact on the water around it. It passed below me and moved back out toward deeper water, and the light faded as it descended. Compass had refused to come down the stairs with me. He sat at the top and watched me with an expression I can only describe as concern. Then came the night in August that changed everything. It was warm, midsummer, the kind of night where the water actually steams slightly as cooler air moves over it. I was in the watchroom, one level below the lantern room, reading and waiting for my midnight rotation check, when I heard something on the exterior gallery. Footsteps, deliberate, evenly spaced, moving around the circumference of the gallery from the seaward side toward the landward side. This should not have been possible. The gallery is 60 feet above the waterline. There is no external access to the gallery from below without going through the lighthouse itself, through the door behind me, which was locked, and up the stairs, which I was sitting beside. Whatever was on that gallery did not come through the lighthouse. I sat completely still and listened. The footsteps were slow. They stopped on the landward side of the gallery, directly outside the window above my chair. For several minutes, nothing. Then something tapped on the glass. 3 times. Deliberate, evenly spaced. The same rhythm as a person knocking on a door. I did not move for a very long time. Compass had gone rigid in his corner, every muscle locked, his eyes fixed on the window above me. He was not growling. He was not making any sound at all. That was the thing that unmade me. In 11 years, I have never seen that dog go silent in the presence of something that frightened him. He always barks, always growls, always makes some sound. The silence meant he was beyond that. Eventually, after what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 minutes, I heard the footsteps again, moving back around the gallery toward the seaward side. And then nothing. I did not go out onto the gallery that night. When dawn came, I unlocked the gallery door and examined every inch of the exterior railing and decking. There was nothing. No marks, no scratches, no evidence that anything had stood out there. But the railing on the seaward side was wet in a way that the surrounding surfaces were not, as if something that had come up out of the water had gripped it. I measured the wet area. Whatever had held that railing had a grip span of approximately 4 feet. I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. I know how this sounds. I am a practical man. I have a background in marine engineering. I believe in observable evidence and logical explanation and the kind of cause and effect relationship that the physical world is supposed to operate on. But I have seen what I have seen, and I have logged every instance, and I have eliminated every rational explanation I could think of, and what I am left with is the following conclusion. There is something in the water off Harwick Point that has been aware of this lighthouse, and of me, for at least 3 years. Possibly much longer. I found the previous keeper's notes last spring, packed in a cardboard box in the storage room on the ground floor. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he kept this light for 22 years before me. His official logs were mundane and professional. But tucked inside the back cover of his final official journal was a folded piece of paper, handwritten, that read as follows. I am writing this for whoever comes after me. There are things in the water here that are not fish and not whales and not anything that any marine biologist would recognize. They have been here as long as the lighthouse has been here, possibly longer. They are not aggressive. In 22 years, they have never done anything I would characterize as threatening. But they are aware of the light. I believe they are drawn to it. I believe they have been drawn to lights on this point since long before any lighthouse existed here. Since the time when fishermen would burn signal fires on the rocks to guide their boats home. I believe the light is a form of communication to them, or perhaps a form of welcome. I do not know what they are. I do not know where they go when they are not here. I do not know if they are singular beings or a population of many. What I know is that the longer you keep this light, the more aware of you they will become. By my 20th year here, I could feel them sometimes, a pressure in the water, a change in the atmosphere. Before they were visible, my dog knew before I did every time. Always. If your dog will not look at the water, do not look at the water. If your dog will not come downstairs, do not go downstairs. And if you hear something on the gallery that did not come through the lighthouse, do not open the gallery door. Not because they are dangerous, but because once you have seen them directly, truly directly, face to face, the light stops being enough. You will need to be closer to it. You will feel the need to be in the water with it. And that is not something a human being can survive. I read those words sitting on the floor of the storage room, and I felt the cold spread from my chest outward to my fingers and toes. Gerald Marsh disappeared in October of his 23rd year. The Coast Guard report listed him as a missing person, presumed to have fallen from the gallery during a storm. His body was never recovered. The box of his personal effects had been sitting in my storage room for 11 years, and nobody had ever told me any of this. I have been here 11 years. 3 years ago the lights began. I have never opened the gallery door when I heard footsteps outside. I have followed every instruction Gerald Marsh left me without knowing they existed until last spring. But last month something changed. The lights have been appearing every night. Not just once or twice a week as they used to. Every single night, without exception, for 31 days straight. They are closer than they have ever been. 2 nights ago one of them was in the boat landing itself, filling the shallow water between the rocks with that deep cold glow, and the size of it was beyond anything I have language to describe. It was not a sea creature. It was not bioluminescence. It was not light reflected from any surface or refracted through any lens. It was something alive and enormous, and it was pressed into a space too small for it, and it was looking up at the lighthouse. I know it was looking up at the lighthouse because the light moved in a way that tracked the rotation of the beam. Every time the lighthouse beam swept in a different direction, The light below shifted slightly in the same direction, as if it were following, as if it were responding. And last night, for the first time in 11 years, Compass walked down to the bottom of the access stairs and stood at the railing above the boat landing and looked at the water for a long time without growling, without barking, with his tail moving slowly. Not the fast wag of excitement. The slow, gentle movement that means he has decided something is safe. Then he turned and looked at me over his shoulder. I did not go down to the boat landing. I brought him back inside and locked the lower door and sat in the watch room until sunrise. But I have been thinking about Gerald Marsh all day. I have been thinking about what he wrote. That once you see them directly, you need to be closer to the light, that you need to be in the water with it. I have been thinking about whether that is a warning or a description, whether what happened to him was a tragedy or a choice. The light is rotating above me right now. I can hear the mechanism turning, the gears moving in their patient circle, the beams sweeping out across the water that I have watched for 11 years. And out there in the darkness, below the surface, I can see the glow. It is directly below the lighthouse tonight. It has never been that close before. It is beautiful. I did not expect it to be beautiful. In all my notes, in all my observations, I described the lights in technical terms, their color temperature, their apparent depth, their movement patterns. I never wrote the word beautiful because I was afraid that if I wrote it, I would have to acknowledge what it meant. It means that whatever is down there is not frightening me the way it used to. It means that Compass and I, and whatever lives in this water, have been circling each other for 3 years, and something has shifted between us. It means I am going to go down to the boat landing tonight, and I am going to find out what Gerald Marsh found out in his 23rd year. I am writing this down so that whoever comes after me will have more than he left me. I am going to leave this composition book on top of the official Coast Guard journal so that the next keeper finds both at the same time. Whatever happens tonight, I want the record to exist. I want someone to know that I was not a man who went mad in his isolation. I was not a man who fell from the gallery in a storm. I was a man who kept this light for 11 years, who logged every observation faithfully, who followed the rules of this place until the place itself changed the rules. The light is very bright tonight. The water is very still. Compass is waiting at the top of the access stairs. I am going down. The second time I ever saw the light, I was 23 years old, and I had been working as a deckhand on a commercial fishing vessel out of Gloucester, Massachusetts for less than 1 season. The boat was called the Eleanor May, a 60-foot stern trawler that her captain, a man named Frank Delaney, had bought secondhand from a retiring fisherman in Newfoundland. Frank was 60 years old, weathered to something approaching leather, with the kind of calm that comes not from peace of mind, but from having survived enough terrifying things that new terrifying things no longer register as significant. He had fished the North Atlantic for 40 years. He had been through storms that sank other boats. He had lost crew members to the sea and come back the following season and gone out again. He was the most unflappable man I have ever met in my life, and what I saw that night in October unflapped him completely. There were 4 of us on the Eleanor May that trip. Frank, his nephew Danny who ran the net machinery, a cook and general hand named Rosario who had been working with Frank for 12 years, and me, the new kid, learning the job and grateful for the work. We were 3 days out, dragging for groundfish in an area of the bank that Frank had fished successfully for 20 years. The weather had been cooperative, the catch was good, and the mood on the boat was the quiet satisfaction of work going well. I was on watch from midnight to 4 in the morning. Frank had gone below to sleep. Danny was in his bunk. Rosario was in the galley doing something with the next day's provisions. It was just me in the wheelhouse, watching the radar screen, monitoring the engine readings, occasionally scanning the water with the deck lights. Then I saw it visually, a pale greenish-white glow below the surface, diffuse but clearly a single source, moving slowly from west to east across our heading. My first thought was a submarine, though I knew enough to know that military submarines don't operate with navigation lights visible from the surface. My second thought was some kind of research vessel running equipment below the surface. I reached for the radio to call it in, and then I saw the second light. This one was larger, behind the first one and to the right, moving in the same direction but at a slightly different depth. The glow from this one was more intense, the edges of it shading from pale green into something almost blue. And it was big enough that even at 200 yards and through the depth of water, I could see it illuminating the bottom of our trawl net, where it dragged behind us. The net began to behave strangely. Instead of its normal smooth drag through the water, it started pulling to the left, as if whatever was below was interacting with it. I felt the change in the boat's motion before I fully understood what was happening. The Eleanor May was being pulled slightly off course. I cut the deck lights and looked at the water in the darkness, and what I saw then made my stomach drop straight to the bottom of the sea. The lights were not traveling parallel to us anymore. They had turned. Both of them had changed direction, and they were now moving toward the Eleanor May. And I could see now that there were more of them. Not two lights, but many, coming from depth, rising slowly toward the surface, arranged in a formation that was too regular, too deliberate, too geometrically precise to be any natural phenomenon I had ever heard of. They were in a pattern like points on a compass, 8 of them forming a rough circle with something larger, brighter, deeper at the center that I could only barely see, but could feel in the same way you can feel the bass frequencies of music in your chest before your ears register the sound. I hit the intercom. I called Frank. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I told him he needed to come up to the wheelhouse now. Not urgently, not panicked, just that there was something he needed to see. He came through the wheelhouse door in 30 seconds, which told me that he had not actually been asleep, that he had been lying in his bunk awake, waiting. He stepped up beside me and looked at the water, and I watched his face in the light from the instrument panels. He went through several expressions in quick succession. Recognition was the one that stayed. Not surprise. Recognition. He said one word. He said cut. I understood he meant the nets. I reached for the net release, but he had already moved past me and hit it himself, dumping the trawl doors and releasing the net and everything in it into the water in one motion. 12 hours of catch, gone in 3 seconds. Then he went to the wheel and pushed the throttle forward and turned us hard to starboard, away from the lights. I watched through the window as we came around. The circle of lights was still there, and the thing at the center was rising. I could see it more clearly now, no longer a glow at depth, but a presence that was coming up through the water with a slowness that implied a size I wasn't able to calculate. It was not reaching the surface quickly, but it was not small. The outer lights, the 8 points of the compass formation, began moving faster as we pulled away, and for a few minutes I was certain they were going to pursue us. They did not. They slowed and stopped, and I watched them recede as the Eleanor May made the best speed she could away from whatever was rising in that patch of North Atlantic. Frank didn't say anything for 40 minutes. He just drove, watching the radar, watching the water, drinking coffee that Rosario brought without being asked. When he finally spoke, he didn't look at me. He said he'd seen them before. He said the first time was about 20 years ago, same general area of the bank, different boat. He said the lights had come up under them that time too, and the captain of that boat had made the same decision he'd just made. Cut the nets and run. He said in 20 years he had never once heard of a boat that did that being damaged or lost. He said he had heard of 3 boats that for whatever reason didn't run or couldn't run fast enough. 2 of those boats were found adrift with no crew aboard and no explanation for the absence of the crew. The 3rd boat was never found at all. He said he did not know what the lights were. He said he had asked everyone who had ever fished this bank long enough to have an opinion, and the answers he'd gotten ranged from submarine activity to bioluminescent algae blooms to the kind of explanation that fishermen don't usually offer because they are practical people who spend their working lives on the physical ocean and they don't have a lot of patience for the non-physical. But he said, and this was the part I've carried with me ever since, that every man who'd been on the water long enough to have seen the lights agreed on one thing. The lights knew you were there. They weren't random. They weren't coincidental. They were responding to the presence of your vessel in some way that none of them could explain. And every man agreed that once the lights turned toward you, the only reasonable response was to leave. We fished a different area of the bank for the rest of the trip. When we got back to Gloucester, I found myself looking for other people who had seen the lights. I didn't have much luck. Fishermen are not a superstitious group as a general rule, but they are a group that has learned to not talk about certain things because talking about them tends to raise questions about your judgment that are professionally inconvenient. I got bits and pieces. A couple of guys from other boats who'd seen something similar. An old man who'd been fishing since the 1960s who said the lights had been a known phenomenon on this part of the bank for generations, that his father had seen them, that his grandfather had spoken of them. He said the old-timers called them the deeps, not as a description but as a name, like the deeps were a specific thing with a specific identity that the fishing community had an implicit understanding with. He said the understanding was simple. You see them, you leave. You don't interfere with them. You don't investigate them. You don't report them in your official log because nobody official is going to help you, and writing it down just attracts scrutiny. You leave and you don't go back to that spot for the rest of the season. And if you're smart, you change your route to avoid that area permanently. I have followed that understanding for 26 years. I gave up commercial fishing after 3 seasons and went into the Coast Guard, then into marine research, and eventually I ended up managing the Historical Records Division of a maritime museum in Rockland, which is the kind of job that lets me read very old documents about the sea without having to be on the sea very often. In the course of this work, I have encountered historical references to the deeps, or things that sound very much like the deeps, going back to the earliest European accounts of fishing activity off the New England coast. Colonial-era fishing logs, not official records, but the private journals that fishermen kept before anyone was systematically collecting that kind of data, contain references to lights beneath the water that appear in the same general areas of the bank where I've seen them, described in the same terms, accompanied by the same recommendation: leave immediately and do not return. There are references in Abenaki oral tradition as well, filtered through the written accounts of early missionaries who clearly didn't understand what they were recording, to something in the deep water off the coast that the coastal Abenaki considered sacred and strictly avoided. The missionaries interpreted this as superstition. The maritime archaeologist I consulted with 2 years ago, when I showed her my research, interpreted it as the survival of knowledge about a genuine phenomenon that the human inhabitants of this coast had been managing their relationship with for a very long time. She was the first person with professional credentials who took any of this seriously. We spent 6 months trying to find some scientific framework for what we were describing, some category of known phenomenon that could account for lights of this size and behavior at the depths we were talking about. We found nothing. There is no known biological organism that produces bioluminescence at the scale I observed from the Eleanor May or that the lighthouse keeper at Harwick Point has been describing in his private journals. Journals which came to the museum after his disappearance 2 months ago, along with the rest of his personal effects. His name was Thomas Aldric. He served as keeper of the Harwick Point Lighthouse for 11 years. He disappeared in October. The Coast Guard report listed him as a missing person, presumed to have fallen from the gallery during a storm. His body was never recovered. His composition notebook was on top of his official log, exactly where he said he would leave it. His dog was found sitting at the bottom of the access stairs that lead to the boat landing, looking at the water. The dog would not move for 18 hours. When he finally came away from the stairs voluntarily, the museum's director, who had gone to collect Aldric's effects, brought the dog to a shelter in Rockport where he was eventually adopted by a family in Camden. I know this because I checked. I needed to know that the dog was alright. Because the thing about compass, the thing that Thomas Aldric understood better than he knew how to articulate in his notebook, is that the dog's silence in the presence of the lights was not a failure of instinct. It was not a sign that the dog was beyond fear. It was a sign that the dog had arrived at something beyond the need for fear, that the dog had recognized something, that whatever is in that water had, over 11 years, communicated something to this one specific animal that made him stop being afraid. I have been thinking about that dog sitting at the top of the access stairs and looking at Thomas Aldric over his shoulder for 3 months now. I have been thinking about what it means that Thomas Aldric did not go down to the boat landing that night. Or perhaps I should say I have been thinking about what it means that Thomas Aldric did go down to the boat landing that night. Because the notebook says he was going down. The notebook says he had decided. The notebook says the light was beautiful and that he was no longer afraid in the way he used to be. Gerald Marsh, who kept the light for 22 years before Aldric, also disappeared. The pattern is not subtle. And yet I find myself, on the nights when I am working late at the museum and the building is quiet and the harbor outside the window is dark and still, thinking about those lights. Thinking about Frank Delaney's voice in the wheelhouse of the Eleanor May, flat and certain and old, saying the word cut. Thinking about how that word was not fear and was not bravery. It was just knowledge. The knowledge of someone who understood the terms of an arrangement that had been in place longer than anyone living could remember. Cut the nets and run. And I think about Thomas Aldric, who did not run. who had 11 years of evidence in front of him and still walked down those stairs into the dark. And I cannot decide, even now, even with everything I know, whether what he did was the bravest or the most foolish or the most inevitable thing I have ever heard of. What I know is this: the lights are still out there. They have always been out there. They were there before the lighthouse, and they will be there after it, after all of us, turning slowly in the deep water with a patience that is not human, and a light that is not natural, and a curiosity about us that I cannot explain and cannot dismiss. They know the lighthouse is there. They know someone tends it. They are, in whatever way a thing that lives in the deep ocean can be said to be patient, waiting. For what? I do not know. For another 11 years of a careful man's observations. For another dog to decide something is safe. For the next keeper who reads the previous keeper's notes and understands, too late or perhaps at exactly the right time, that the light we use to warn ships away from the rocks has been having a different kind of conversation entirely with whatever lives beneath the water. The Harwick Point Lighthouse has a new keeper. He started in November. I have not contacted him. I have thought about it many times. I have thought about whether Thomas Aldric would have done things differently if Gerald Marsh had left him more. But then I remember what Gerald Marsh wrote, that the longer you keep this light, the more aware of you they become. And I think perhaps some things need to be discovered on their own terms, in their own time, by the person whose job it is to keep the light burning so that the things in the water have something to come toward. I will tell you this, though, and this is the last thing I will say on the subject. 2 weeks ago, I drove up to Harwick Point on a Tuesday night in November. I parked at the Lighthouse access road and walked down to the boat landing. The new keeper's light was on in the watchroom. The sea was calm. I stood at the railing above the boat landing and looked at the water. And there, in the dark water below the lighthouse, I saw the glow. Pale green, diffuse, enormous, moving with that same slow, deliberate intelligence I first saw from the deck of the Eleanor made 26 years ago. And for the first time in 26 years, instead of the cold fear that has been my constant companion whenever I've thought about that night, I felt something else. Something that I don't entirely have a word for. Something adjacent to recognition. Like seeing a light in a window of a house you grew up in, years after you've moved away, and understanding that the house is still there and something in it is still awake. I drove home. I did not tell the new keeper what I had seen. I am writing this down instead. I am leaving it where someone will find it, because that is what you do when you have information that matters and don't know who needs it yet. The lights are in the water. They have always been in the water. And one day, if you keep the light long enough, they will come close enough for you to understand what they want. Whether you run or whether you go down to the boat landing when they do is the only choice in this whole story that has ever actually belonged to you.